Before the Ice Age, there was about 1,000 miles (1,600 kilometers) of land connecting what is now Alaska with Siberia on the Asian continent. This is known as Bering Bridge. Through this route about 25,000 years ago Asians migrated to the American continent in small groups and settled in different areas and formed societies. They gradually acquired expertise in fields like agriculture and building construction. During the Ice Age about 11,000 years ago they were cut off from the Asian continent when the Bering Bridge sank into the ocean. The rest of the world forgot them and the existence of the two American continents with them until Christopher Columbus, a Spanish sailor from Europe, set foot on the island of Puerto Rico in the Pacific Ocean on November 19, 1493. This new world was gradually named America. The tribes of Asian descent who settled there from time immemorial were called Indigenous Americans, Native Americans. Shortly after the arrival of the Europeans, a large percentage of Native Americans became extinct due to the impact of infectious diseases that entered the Americas with them. The original inhabitants of the U.S. are believed to be Alaskans who migrated from Asia between 4,000 and 12,000 years ago. Called the pre-Columbian Mississippian culture, they developed sophisticated agriculture, rich architecture, and small communities. Later, millions of U.S. natives died due to epidemics of infectious diseases such as smallpox imported by European immigration. What is now the U.S. mainland was once the land of the U.S. Native Americans. With the Spanish Empire Treaty in 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered several Caribbean islands and made a treaty with these U.S. native inhabitants. On April 2, 1513, the Spanish hero Juan Ponce de Leon became the first European to set foot on the present-day U.S. mainland, based on treaty documents in what he called La Florida. Then began a series of Spanish treaties in the southwestern part of the present-day United States. French wool traders established settlements around the great estuaries of New France. Eventually the French took control of most of North America below the Gulf of Mexico. In 1607, the first English settlement appeared in what is now Jamestown, Virginia colony. Later in 1620 the Pilgrims founded Plymouth Colony. This influx of immigrants resulted in the Massachusetts Bay Colony chartering a ship in 1628. After 1610, 50,000 convicts were transported by Britain to the American colonies during the American movement. In 1614, the Dutch established permanent settlements along the Hudson River along with New Amsterdam and Manhattan. 1674 the Dutch ceded their American lands to the English. A portion of the state of New Netherland was named New York. Two-thirds of the newly arrived immigrants were indentured laborers, especially in southern Virginia between 1630 and 1680. By the 18th century African slaves had become the main source of indentured labor in many regions. By 1729 the Carolina departments and by 1732 the Georgia colonies and the 13 British colonies formed the United States of America. A growing devotion to the rights of the Old English and the goal of independent government led to a vigorous strengthening of the Republican Party by holding free elections by all provincial governments. All African slave trade was legalized. The country's population grew exponentially, with the birth rate increasing and the death rate decreasing, while regulating migration. The Christian religious revival that arose between 1730–1740 awakened religious freedom among the people. British forces captured Canada from the French in the French and Indian War. However, the Francophone people remained politically isolated beyond the southern colonies. The population of the 13 British colonies, excluding Native Americans sent out of the 13 British colonies, reached 2.6 million by 1770. One-third of the Americans were British, and one-fifth were enslaved African Americans. American colonists had no right to participate in the Constitution of Great Britain following British taxation systems. The conflict between the American colonies and the British between 1760–1770 eventually led to the American Revolutionary War, which lasted from 1775 to 1781. On June 14, 1775, the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia and established an army called the Continental Army at the behest of George Washington. In 1776, the United States Congress declared independence with Thomas Jefferson's motto that all men are created equal and endowed with special and inalienable rights. That day is now celebrated as America's Independence Day. A weak confederal government established by the Articles of Confederation from 1777 lasted until 1789. After the American troops with the help of French and Spain defeated the British, Great Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America and the American autonomy up to the west of the Mississippi River. A constitutional convention was held in 1787 to establish a strong federal government that could levy taxes. Later in 1788 the Constitution of the United States was formed, and in 1789 the first Republican senator, House of Representatives and President George Washington took shape. In 1791, the Bill of Rights was adopted, prohibiting the freedom of the obnoxious person, and guaranteeing legal protection. There was a change in the methods of slavery. A provision in the Constitution protected the Atlantic Slave Act only until 1808. Between 1780 and 1804, the northern states abolished the slave trade, leaving the South as the protectors of eccentric policies. The second movement that began in the 1800s led to various social reforms such as the abolition of the slave trade and the purchase of land by date. The eagerness shown by the Americans in the westward expansion of the kingdom led to a series of Indian wars. In 1803, under the leadership of President Jefferson, the Louisiana Purchase, a French possession, doubled the size of the country. A declaration of war on Britain in 1812 by many complaints strengthened U.S. nationalism. A series of U.S. military raids on Florida in 1819 forced Spain and other Gulf outlaws to abandon the coastal areas. Texas joined the United States in 1845. The Oregon Treaty with Britain in 1846 led to the U.S. taking possession of the present-day American Northwest. U.S. victory in the Mexican-American War led to the U.S. annexation of California in 1848, the present-day more northwestern United States. The California Gold Rush of 1848–1849 encouraged further westward migration. New railway lines led to the relocation of settlers and conflicts with Native Americans. After 50 years of slaughtering more than 40 million American head of cattle for leather and meat, the expansion of the railroads made it easier. The loss of cattle herds, the main resource of the native Indians, dealt an irreparable blow to the existence of Indians and many local cultures. Tensions between free states and slave states brought the relationship between the state and federal governments to a head. By 1860, Abraham Lincoln, a member of the Republican Party and staunch anti-slavery, was elected president. Within his inauguration, the 7 pro-slavery states passed a resolution to secede and form the Confederate States of America in protest of the federal government's illegal program. The Civil War began with the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter. Apart from that, 4 more states joined the Confederacy. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Proclamation of Emancipation to slaves in the Confederacy. Following the victory of the Union in 1865, 3 amendments to the U.S. Constitution determined to free the approximately 4 million enslaved African Americans by making them citizens and giving them the right to vote. War, its clarity made the federal powerful enough. The war remains the deadliest conflict in American history, with over 620,000 soldiers killed as a result. After the war, Abraham Lincoln was fired upon and set about re-establishing Republican policies by guaranteeing the rights of newly freed slaves to reunify the Southern states. Controversies that arose after the 1876 presidential election ended with the Compromise of 1877, which later reinstated Jim Crow laws for African Americans. Urbanization of the northern lands led to a new, irregular flow of migration from the south. It accelerated the industrialization of the Eastern European country. Waves of immigrants continued to transform American culture by providing labor until 1929. Rapid economic development has led to the development of utility infrastructure. The expansion of the country was completed with the purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867. The Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890 remains the major military battle against the Indians. Pacific Kingdom. The indigenous monarchy of Hawaii was overthrown in 1893 by a sudden uprising led by Native Americans. In 1998 the United States annexed the adjacent Sea Islands archipelagos. The victory of the Spanish-American War in the same year not only demonstrated the power of the United States to the world, but also led to the annexation of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. 50 years later, the Philippines became independent. Puerto Rico and Guam remained a part of the American Union. After World War I broke out in 1914, the United States remained neutral. Many Americans sympathized with the British and French. However, many are opposed to taking the plunge. By 1917, the United States was also involved in the war. American foreign armies helped turn against the Central Powers. After the war, the Senate did not ratify the Treaty of Versailles, which established the United Nations. The country followed unilateral policies and isolated restrictions. In the 1920s, the women's rights movement succeeded and led to constitutional amendments proposing women's right to vote. The roar of the Roaring Twenties, which caused great stress, came to an end with the Wall Street crash of 1929. In 1932 Franklin D. After Roosevelt's election as president, he responded to a new proposal for a series of policies that required government intervention in the economy, including social protection. By the 1930s, dust blowing in the Midlands impoverished many agricultural groups and encouraged a wave of migration towards Padamati. The United States remained neutral in World War II until Germany invaded Poland in September 1939. Later, from 1941, it took part in the war effort by providing goods to the Allied countries through the Lend-Lease scheme. After the Imperial Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States joined forces with Allied powers against Allied powers and imprisoned thousands of Japanese Americans. Engaging in war encouraged investment and industrial power. The United States was the only wealthy nation among the major combatants. Indeed, the United States has become a wealthy country that is incomparable to the rest of the countries that have been plunged into poverty due to the war. The Allied conferences at Bretton Woods and Yalta introduced a new system of international organizations with the United States and the Soviet Union at the center of world affairs. After the European victory, the legislation presented by the United States at an international conference in San Francisco in 1945 took effect after the war. After the atomic bomb was tested on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during the war, the United States came to light as the first country to develop atomic bombs. Japan surrendered on September 2, ending the war. During the post-World War II Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union raced for supremacy. European military action by the Soviet Union was dominated by NATO, the Warsaw Incident. They competed in representing wars as well as developing powerful atomic bombs. However, both countries have been avoiding direct war. The U.S. often opposed left-wing movements that it believed were being supported by the Soviet Union. The Korean War of 1950–53 saw American forces fighting Communist China and North Korea. During the senator's tenure as nominal anti-communist leader, the United Nations American Activities Committee conducted a series of investigations into left-wing policies. In 1961, after sending the first Soviet manned spacecraft to Rhodesia, President F.F. encouraged by Kennedy's call, the United States put a man on the moon for the first time in 1969. Kennedy also faced pressure over the nuclear bomb on Soviet forces in Cuba. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and the nonviolent struggle for civil rights of African Americans flourished. Kennedy was later shot dead in 1963. Also, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were passed by President Lyndon B. Issued under Johnson. He also signed the Medicare and Medicaid Act. Johnson and his successor, Nixon, represented the unsuccessful Vietnam War in Southeast Asia. The movement that erupted in opposition to the war with the cooperation of counterculturalists, black nationalists, and women's liberationists took a serious form. The women's liberation movement continued under the leadership of Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, and others seeking political, social, and economic rights. Nixon was sworn in again in 1974 to avoid obstruction of justice and abuse of power by being part of an impeachment as a result of the Watergate scandal. He is the first president to be sworn in for a second term. In the late 1970s, under Jimmy Carter, the country faced inflation and an influx of Iranian protégés. The election of Ronald Reagan to the presidency in 1980 brought about changes in American politics due to issues such as taxation and spending on essentials. His second term in office saw the Iran-Contra scandal as well as diplomatic ties with the Soviet Union. As a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union, indirect warfare came to light. The United States, under the leadership of George Bush, played a leading role in the United Nations-sponsored war in the Arabian Gulf. 1991 to 2001 was the longest economic expansion in U.S. history. In 1998, a civil case he faced during the administration of Bill Clinton, an extramarital affair, led to allegations of Clinton fraud. However, he continued in office. 2000 was the first time in U.S. history that a presidential election issue was resolved by a U.S. Supreme Court decision. George H.W. Bush's son, George W. Bush, became president. On September 11, 2001, al-Qaeda militants attacked the New York World Trade Center, Washington, D.C. Around 3,000 people died in the nearby Pentagon, D.C. massacre. As a result, the Bush administration launched an international war of terror, invading Afghanistan, deposing the Taliban government and withdrawing al-Qaeda training camps. Taliban insurgents continue to wage guerrilla warfare. In 2002, the Bush administration's push for Iraqi constitutional changes led to controversy. In 2003, U.S.-led forces invaded Iraq and ousted Saddam Hussein. The 2005 Hurricane Katrina wreaked havoc in the Gulf of Mexico, devastating New Orleans and remaining one of the most recognizable tragedies in American history. In 2008, Barack Obama, the first African-American president, was elected president amid an international economic downturn. After 2 years, mainly health care and economic policy reforms were implemented. In 2011, U.S. Navy SEALs raided Pakistan and killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda. The Iraq War came to an end in December 2011 when the remaining U.S. forces were withdrawn. On average, every household in America owns one car. There are 39% of the families raising 7.75 million dogs. 1.5 million families have different types of birds, 9.36 crore families have cats, 1.33 crore families are rearing horses. Dog trade is worth $4,500 crore. This amount is more than the gross domestic product (GDP) of 114 countries. America's share in the world's defense expenditure is 44%. 25% of African Americans are poor, 6.64 million are homeless, and the unemployment rate is 9.5%. 60% of Americans live in air pollution. 10 biggest cities in America: New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, City of Phoenix, San Antonio, San Diego, Dallas, Detroit, St. Louis, Pinkham Grant, New Hampshire. List of states: Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Hawaii, Idaho, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, to Kentucky, Louisiana, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, North Carolina, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, South Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Vermont, Virginia, Washington, Wisconsin, Wyoming, West Virginia. Please like, share, subscribe.